Welcome to Teaching the Truth with Pastor Eric C. Bogan.
Clearly define what I am to do. Let every word penetrate the heart. Let what is said lead them running to your arm. Use me, Lord. Use me, Lord.
Welcome to another edition of our homeschool, which is a virtual Sunday school that we host every Sunday morning at 10 a.m. Today we're going to be studying, we're turning to the book of Joshua, chapter 1. Chapter 1 of Joshua and verse 7, it reads, "Only be thou strong and very courageous, that thou mayest observe to do according to all the law, which Moses my servant commanded thee. Turn not from it to the right hand or to the left, that thou mayest prosper whithersoever thou goest." Verse 8, "This book of the law shall not depart out of thy mouth, but thou shalt meditate therein day and night, that thou mayest observe to do according to all that is written therein. For then thou shalt make thy way prosperous, and then thou shalt have good success." Of course, these are the words of the Lord to Joshua, who at the time was leading the children of Israel into the promised land. And Moses had just died. Joshua was now in charge. And God was encouraging Joshua to be strong, to be courageous. And he reminded Joshua that if he would do three things, put the word of the Lord and his word of the law in his mouth, if he would meditate on it, and if he would do it, he said he would have good success. In fact, he says it both in verse 7. Look at the end of verse 7. He says, "Turn not from it," meaning the law, "to the right hand or to the left, that thou mayest prosper." That word prosper there is from a Hebrew word that is translated good success in verse 8. Look at verse 8. Jump down to the end. He says, "For then thou shalt make thy way," again, prosperous. That's the same word as good success. "And then thou shalt have good success." Those are the exact same Hebrew words. And so what we find here in these two verses is the use of the word prosper or good success appears both in verse 7 and in verse 8. And that tells us that these two verses, verses 7 and verse 8, are connected. They're connected. That is, what keeps us from turning to the left hand or to the right hand, as he points out in verse 7, what keeps us on the path of good success is what I pointed out, what we think with our minds, what we say with our mouths, and what we do with our actions. In other words, we might say, if you pull your hand out, success is largely determined by what we think, by what we say, and by what we do. Our success, be it in life, be it in ministry, be it in the things of God, is determined largely by what we think, say, and do. If we're going to succeed, if we're going to prosper in the things of God and in life, we're going to have to pay close attention to what we think, to what we say, and to what we do. And if we turn over to Matthew chapter 15, we turn over to Matthew chapter 15, we'll see something very interesting there in Matthew 15, beginning at verse 18. And we read, "But those things," Jesus is here speaking, he says, "but those things which proceeds out of the mouth come forth from the heart, and they defile a man." Verse 19, "For out of the heart proceeds evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornications, thefts, false witnesses, and blasphemies." Blasphemies, rather. So we see here in this passage in Matthew 15, Jesus is pointing out not only the importance of watching what we say, and we talked a lot about that in our previous homeschool sessions. We were speaking on the different expressions of faith, and we spent a great deal of time talking about our words and how our words can affect our faith. But Jesus says something interesting here, and that is before words get to our mouth, they come up out of our hearts. They come up out of our hearts. In fact, he says at the end of verse 19, he says, "For out of the heart proceeds evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornications, thefts, false witnesses, and blasphemies." And when he's talking about the heart here, he's not talking about that organ that pumps blood in our body. He's speaking about our minds. And he says, out of our minds perceive evil thoughts. The murders, the adulteries, the fornications, these are all, he's talking about the evil thoughts of murders, the evil thoughts of adulteries, the evil thoughts of fornications. In fact, if you look at the Amplified Bible, verse 19, it says, "For out of the heart," that is, out of our minds, out of our inward man, he says, "out of the heart comes evil thoughts, reasonings, disputings, and designs, such as murder, adultery, sexual vice, theft, false witnesses, slander, and irreverent speeches." So the thoughts are thoughts of committing murder, adultery, designs of committing murder, sexual vice, slander, so forth and so on. So he's saying that the wickednesses that we are so accustomed to and we know so very well, sometimes we forget that those evil actions are birthed out of evil thoughts, are birthed out of evil thoughts. And as I said, the heart in this passage doesn't represent that organ in our body that pumps blood. In this case, the heart refers to the seat of our thoughts and our decisions. That's the place where we make decisions that our thoughts are. In fact, our heart represents who we truly are, who we truly are. It says in Proverbs chapter 23, very familiar passage, in verse 7, he says, "For as he," that is, as a man, "thinks in his heart, so is he." As a man thinks in his heart, so is he. We're whatever we think. One of the first things we need to realize that's a key to our success is realizing that our thoughts is making us who we are. And we need to start there. We need to start there. And there's a few things that we want to say to you about our thoughts. The first is this. Again, take a look at your handout. And it is this. We can commit sins by our thoughts. We can commit sins by our thoughts. Turn over to Proverbs 24. Some of us are unaware of that. We think that our thoughts are private, that our thoughts really have no bearing on our relationships, particularly our relationship with God. and even with others. But the fact of the matter is, as we read the scriptures, we realize that thoughts can condemn us. We commit sins by our thoughts. It says in Proverbs 24 and verse 9, it says, the thought of foolishness is sin. Notice, the very thought of foolishness is sin. Now, the word thought in this passage, Proverbs 24:9, this word thought means plan or scheme. The word thought here is not just a random thought that passes through our mind. Instead it means a plan or a scheme. God is not saying that random thoughts that pass through your mind is a sin. There's no sin in a thought springing up in your mind. In fact, this is one of the ways in which Satan tries to tempt us. This is one way temptation comes. It comes through our mind. So just having a random thought in your mind about a particular thing is not the sin. Instead, the sin is allowing that thought to dwell in your heart to the point where it becomes an evil emotion. And that comes when we meditate on that thought. That comes when we think on that thought and we dwell on it. In Matthew chapter 5, turn over there for just a moment. We see some words here in Matthew 5 from Jesus that talks about the power of dwelling on thoughts and what they can really lead to. In Matthew 5, in verse 21, we read these words. Jesus says, you have heard that it was said by them of old time, thou shalt not kill, and whosoever shall kill shall be in danger of judgment. But I say to you that whosoever is angry with his brother without cause shall be in danger of judgment. And whosoever shall say to his brother, Raka, shall be in danger of the council. So we see here in this passage that Jesus is basically expanding their understanding and our understanding of the law. He says, you've heard it said that whoever commits murder is guilty of judgment, has broken the law, has committed a sin. But he says, I say to you, whoever will be angry with his brother. Again, anger is something that's produced when we dwell on thoughts, particularly thoughts of offense, thoughts of being misused or persecuted. When we think on those thoughts, then anger is produced. And he says, being angry with your brother is as much a sin as murdering him. And he even goes as far as to say that not only committing the act of murder, not only preparing plans of murder in your heart is a sin or in your mind, but saying irreverent words, raka, cursing your brother, it's also a sin. So all these things are a sin. And so if you pull in your handout, one of the things that we need to realize is this, and that is sin can be committed with our words, with our actions, and here today we're talking about committing them with our thoughts. Our thoughts are powerful. They're as powerful as words and as powerful as our actions. And we can find ourselves in judgment. We can find ourselves under condemnation from God and unable to be successful, not simply because of what we do or fail to do, not even simply because of what we say and what we fail to say. We'll find ourselves unsuccessful, unable to succeed in any venture because of our thoughts. And this is something that we really need to realize. Go to Isaiah 55. Turn to Isaiah 55. And so because Jesus is here, really the Bible is placing our thoughts on the same level as our actions. It's important for us to begin to start treating our thoughts the same way we treat our actions. We need to treat sinful thoughts the way we would treat a sinful act. It says in Isaiah 55 in verse 7, notice, he says, "Let the wicked forsake his way, and the unrighteous man his thoughts, and let him return unto the Lord, and he will have mercy upon him, and to our God, for he will abundantly pardon." Notice, just as the wicked ought to forsake his way, it's important that the unrighteous man forsake his thoughts. We know the importance of when we sin to forsake our ways. We know the importance, as we who are believers, we know the importance that when we've committed some sin, we've committed some iniquity, we know that it's important that in our confession that we not just confess our wrong, but that we turn away from it. But what about our thoughts? Do we also know the importance of departing and turning away from sinful thoughts? And many of us aren't doing that. We are forsaking our ways, but we're holding on to the thoughts that help to produce those ways or those actions. And that's a mistake. That's a mistake. Now, what happens when, we realize this mistake and we start trying to change our thoughts and turn away from our thoughts, but we're unsuccessful in doing so? Has it ever happened to you? Have you ever been unsuccessful in trying to put away some evil thought that seems just to be dwelling in your mind? It could be thoughts of immorality, or it could be thoughts, as we talked about early, anger or resentment. Have you ever struggled to forgive someone but not being able to forget it? Have you been unsuccessful in trying to forsake your evil thoughts? If you're struggling to put away sinful thoughts, then I want to give you a bit of advice. It's found in Matthew 5. Let's go back to Matthew 5. Remember, Jesus is here talking about the importance of our thoughts and placing them on the same level as our actions and our words. And he gives us some advice here. He gives us some advice here in Matthew 5:29. He says, "And if thy right eye offend thee, pluck it out and cast it from thee. For it is profitable for thee that one of thy members should perish, and not that thy whole body be cast into hell." He says it's more profitable for one member of our bodies to perish than to have that member cause our whole body to be thrown into hell. And what is his advice? He says if you are being offended, that word means to cause to stumble. Offense means to cause to stumble. If your eye is causing you to stumble, Jesus' advice is remove it, pluck it out, cast it out. Now, he's not speaking here literally, but what he is saying is whatever that thing is that's leading to your evil thoughts or even your evil actions, common sense tells us to get rid of that thing. Get rid of whatever's causing you to continue to meditate on these bad thoughts, these evil thoughts. Then the solution is to get rid of that distraction. And it could be a person, it could be an activity, it could be anything. if something or someone is constantly leading you to think on evil thoughts or say evil things or commit evil actions, then Jesus is advising us that the solution is to remove that distraction. You know, sin's like a cancer. It's like a cancer, and sometimes the only way to get rid of a cancer is you got to cut out everything that's attached to it. Anyone who's ever been diagnosed with cancer or had loved ones that's been diagnosed with cancer understands that cancer is so dangerous. It's so infectious that whatever it touches, the solution is usually to get rid of the thing that has the cancer. So if cancer is touching an organ, to get rid of the whole organ. If cancer is in a particular part of the body, get rid of the whole body. Because the thought is it's better to survive with less members than you would normally have. A loss of a member or a loss of an organ than to have that cancer spread throughout your entire body. And I think it's the same with sin. However sin is causing us to be distracted, either in our thoughts or in our actions, we need to get rid of that. Now, the second thing we need to realize about our thoughts is this, and I want to talk to you about it. Pull out your handout. Again, it says, we can be taken captive by our thoughts. Not only can our thoughts cause us to sin, rather, but we can be taken captive by our thoughts. We can be taken captive by our thoughts. Let's turn to Romans 8. We can be taken captive by our thoughts. And this is also important for us to realize. Romans 8 and verse 5. And it reads, for they that are after the flesh, do mind the things of the flesh. They that are after the flesh do mind the things of the flesh, but they that are after the Spirit, the things of the Spirit. The apostle is telling us here, that whatever we mind or whatever we're thinking on, we tend to go after. We tend to pursue. Whatever we're constantly thinking on and meditating on, the result is we will tend to go after that, or we will tend to pursue it. This is why thoughts can be so dangerous or so vital in our ability to succeed, is because our thoughts is what motivates us to act. It motivates us to pursue a thing. Whatever we think on, whatever we're meditating on, it's what we end up pursuing. And so if you pull out your handout, this is important for us to realize sorry about that. This is what I want you to, it's important for us to realize that those who think on sinful things, will eventually pursue sinful things. Again, those who think on sinful things will eventually pursue sinful things. And those who pursue sinful things will become slaves to sinful things. You see that? Those who think on sinful things will eventually pursue sinful things, and those who pursue sinful things will become slaves to those things. And that's the real danger. That's the real danger of not watching what we think on. Because what we think on will eventually take us captive, make us slaves. We will become slaves to whatever we meditate on, to whatever we think on. So that's so very important for us to realize. Turn with me to John chapter 8. John chapter 8. Jesus says something very similar to this here in John 8 and verse 34. John 8 and 34, it says, Jesus answered them, Verily, verily, I say to you, whosoever committed sin is the servant of sin. Is the servant of sin. And see, this is the danger. When you think on the wrong things, it causes you to do the wrong things. And when you do the wrong things, it makes you slaves to the wrong thing. That's what sin wants to do. We talk about the pleasures of sin, but sin's not in it for the pleasure. Sin's in it for the captivity. Sin always takes you further than where you want to go and keeps you longer than you want to stay. It always takes you further than you want to go and keeps you in a place longer than you want to stay. In fact, sin, particularly sinful thoughts, has a way of becoming like a fortress. Becoming like a fortress in our lives and holding us captive. In 2 Corinthians chapter 10, Paul points this out to us, that sinful thoughts has a way of really taking us captive and becoming like a fortress, a stronghold over our lives. And it's found in 2 Corinthians 10 and verse 4. Paul writes, For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds, casting down imaginations and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, and bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of God, casting down imaginations, every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, and bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ. Notice here where these strongholds that Paul mentions are located. Notice where the strongholds are located. Again, verse 5, casting down imaginations and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God. These strongholds that were mentioned in verse 4 are in our imaginations. One translation says our reasonings and our thoughts. Our imaginations is where the enemy likes to hold us captive. He likes to hold us captive in our thoughts. And notice what the solution is. He says in verse 5, casting down, pulling down. Literally, the word is destroy. The words casting down means to destroy imaginations. Destroy these thoughts that have exalted themselves above the knowledge or the revelation of God. And bringing into captivity every thought, watch, to the obedience of Christ. What does it mean to bring our thoughts unto the obedience of Christ? Well, Christ is the truth. To bring our thoughts, destroy these strongholds by subjecting it to the truth. See, this is how we break the power of evil thoughts in our minds, that these thoughts that are holding us captive. Some people are held captive by lustful thoughts, thoughts on pornography, or thoughts on anger and resentment, as we pointed out earlier. The list goes on and how the enemy can bring strongholds, addictions, causing us to meditate on things over and over again, unhealthy things. the way to break that, is, number one, as we said, removing the thing that's causing that. Maybe it's a person in our life, an individual, or maybe it's something we're watching, we're viewing, something we're listening to. And beyond that, the thing we have to do is to really bring destruction to that power over our thoughts, is to subject it to the truth. To subject it to the truth. Even psychologists say that the way to combat obsessions and preoccupations is with reality or truth. And one of the things they try to do is try to get people to focus on what is true and not be a prisoner and be preoccupied with obsessions and other thoughts. So avoid being controlled and taken captive by your thoughts, and learn how to control your thoughts with the truth. And this is exactly what Paul writes in Philippians. Philippians chapter 4 and verse 8, he writes, finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of good report, if there be any virtue or any good in it, and if there be any praise, watch, think on these things. Think on these things. How do I break the power of sin in my thought life? And again, sin is what will keep us from having success in the things of God. How do we break that power? Think on these things. What things? The things that are in the Word. The things that are in the Word. If you want things that are pure, go to the Word. You want things that are true, go to the Word. You want things that are of good report, that are full of virtue, it's in the Word. If we meditate on the Word, this is exactly what God told Joshua. Meditate on the Word and you will have good success. Sometimes it's so easy, it escapes us. We spend a lot of energy seeking for different plans and schemes on how to be successful, how to overcome obstacles in life, and how to break the chain of defeat in our life. And God simply tells us it starts with your mind, your thoughts. Meditate on my word. Meditate on the truth. If you don't meditate on the truth, if you don't think on these things, then what's going to end up happening is you're going to become a prisoner to evil thoughts. And those evil thoughts are going to keep you out of my promises. And that's exactly where Joshua and the children of Israel were headed to. They were headed into the promise. They were about to take possession of God's promise. And I say to you, believer, as you prepare to take possession of the promises of God, pause, stop, and get your mind, get your head in the Word. If you're going to have success in this venture, if you're going to have success in obtaining and possessing all the promises of God, it's going to have to start with your thoughts. And that's usually not the first thing we start with. We typically start with some action. We're looking to succeed. We're looking to get off on a good footing, as it were. What's the first thing we ask? What do I need to do? What do I need to do? Well, God's plan on getting off on a good start, a good footing, is not what you need to do, but what you need to think. Start with how you think. Else you're going to go out there running around with like a chicken with its head cut off and trying. This is why we try so many things. We're just trying so many things. God says, no, start by thinking on the right things. Because if you don't get your mind right, you will not be able to sustain any progress you make with your actions. You will not be able to sustain it if your mind isn't right. You're going to give up. I think someone once said that games are won and lost, competitions are won and lost mostly with the mind. 80%, I think I heard one person say, 80% of victory is determined by how you think. 80%, that's a large number. 80% of our success is going to be determined right here in this phase, how we think. And so how we think affects so many things, as we said to you earlier. Look at your handout. We said how we think can cause us to commit sin. How we think can cause us to be taken captive. And how we think, he says, we can be changed by our thoughts. You see that? Our thoughts, how we think, can change who we are. We can be changed by our thoughts. Turn with me to Romans chapter 12. We can be changed by our thoughts. Changed by our thoughts. Romans chapter 12 and verse 2. The Apostle Paul writes, he says, and be not conformed to this world, but be ye, notice, transformed, changed by the renewing of your mind. Not by doing something different, by thinking something different. Be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good, acceptable, and perfect will of God. You're looking for God's will for your life. You're looking for his plan for your life. It starts by getting it in your mind. You're transformed by the renewing of your mind, and only then will you prove or see the fulfillment of his good, acceptable, and perfect will. Only then will we see his will, his perfect and acceptable will performed in our life. We've got to be transformed in our minds. In our minds first. It's how we think. Look back at your handout one last time. I want to give you one last bit of evidence, last bit of notes, information rather. He says we can be changed. We can be changed for the better or for the worst by our thoughts. We can be changed for the better or for the worst by our thoughts. Did you know that? Your thoughts will not only change you for the better, they can change you for the worst. You know, what sense would it make for you to be doing all the right things, but because of the way you're thinking, you're undoing it all? You can undo years of progress simply by how you think. If you get a person to think on the wrong thing long enough, you can destroy their life. You can destroy their life. And we are better or worse for how we think. You know, we said to you about how champions are made. And we said that victories and championships are won 80% by what's in our mind, by what we think on. They're also lost that same way. You can lose a battle because of how you think. This is one of the reasons why in athletics, one of the tactics opponents use or teams use on their opponent is to try to get in their head. One of the tactics a team will use or a person will use against his opponent in competition is to try to get in their head, Because if you can get in their head, you can affect their actions and affect their ability to succeed. And games, life is won and lost by what we think on, church. We've got to begin to start training ourselves to think on the right things. If you want to be successful in obtaining the things of God, in carrying out God's plan for your life, you have to start here. You've got to start at the thinking level. This is the level that we got to begin our path. And this is the level that God was telling Joshua he needed to begin. Our thoughts, it can affect what we do in terms of committing sin. It can hold us captive, and we can change or be changed by what's in our mind, for the better or the worse. In fact, if we use one of the passages that we started with earlier, it says, "For as a man thinketh in his heart, so is he." We tend to just look at that in the positive, but he says, as you think, that's how you are. According to how you think, whether good or bad, that's what you're going to be. That's what you're going to be. Notice, that's what you're going to be. How you think is how you're going to be in the end. It starts with our thoughts. So again, we hope that we helped you see some things about gaining success in life and the things of God by focusing on what we think. Next time we'll talk about the role our words and what we say plays in our success. Until then, we encourage you to continue to put His Word first place in your life.
Thank you for listening. If this teaching has been a blessing to you and you'd like to partner with our ministry to share the message of Jesus Christ, please visit our website at www.hmclive.org and click the donate button. If you're in our area, we invite you to join us at 4317 Lippincott Boulevard, Burton, Michigan, 48519. Harris Memorial Church of God in Christ, teaching the truth and showing the love.